Growing up, I always felt like a shadow in my parents' eyes. No matter what I did, their attention was always on my younger brother, Brandon, the family's golden child. So, when my wedding date was set, I wasn't surprised when they brushed off the invitation. "We have Brandon's football game," they said, not even asking what the event was. Little did they know, the event they so easily dismissed was my wedding, and the fallout was about to be catastrophic. Ever since Brandon was born 20 years ago, my parents always put me in second place. He knows he has their full attention and absolutely despises me. Through the years, every time I had an important event, Brandon always got sick or had his own event. I realized that inviting them for my wedding would be a challenge. They'd probably find another excuse to prioritize Brandon over me. But I had to try. With support from my fiancé, I decided to send out a formal wedding invite anyway. When no response came after 2 weeks, even with a text reminder, I decided to visit them. Once I arrived, I asked my mother if they had time for an event I was organizing, one where the date couldn't be moved. My mom said no, since they had Brandon's football game that day. I expected nothing else, so I returned home disheartened. Despite the lack of response from my parents, my fiancé and I got married. The only family not present were my mother, father, and brother. It surprised my grandfather, aunts, and uncles. When I told them what had happened, they turned pale. "They didn't even ask?" my Uncle Ray questioned, shaking his head. "Nope," I replied, trying to hide my disappointment. The day was still beautiful and filled with love, but a noticeable void loomed. My husband and I escaped to the Maldives for our honeymoon, letting ourselves get lost in the beauty and tranquility. For 10 days, we disconnected from the world, turning off our smartphones and simply enjoying each other's company. We swam in the crystal clear waters, took long walks on the beach, and ate delicious food. It was paradise. But as we flew back home, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I had about turning our phones back on. When we got back home from the Maldives, I expected a stack of mail and maybe a few messages, but my phone exploded with notifications. I stared at the screen in disbelief, trying to make sense of the sheer volume of alerts. "What could have possibly happened?" my husband exclaimed, equally confused. We started sifting through the messages, and my heart pounded with anxiety. It felt like we had stepped into another world, a chaotic, troubled one. Voicemails, missed calls, dozens of texts, all from various family members. Something was clearly wrong, and the urgency in their messages made me uneasy. My uncle had called 3 times, Aunt Sarah had left 5 voicemails, and even my usually silent cousin texted me. Each alert felt like a punch. "Have you seen these?" I asked my husband, my voice trembling. He shook his head, scrolling through his own notifications, his expression becoming more worried. My heart sank as I scrolled through increasingly frantic messages. "Why didn't you tell us? How could you do this?" My Aunt Karen's message read, "How could you go through with it without us?" Confusion turned to dread as I realized something had gone terribly wrong back home. Glancing over at my husband, I could see he was just as puzzled, reading through his notifications intently. None of it made any sense to us yet. "Why didn't you tell us? How could you do this?" Messages of disbelief and anger kept pouring in. Confusion turned to dread as I realized something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. My stomach churned, knots forming as I tried to piece together what could have sparked this outrage. My husband, equally baffled, suggested we visit my parents' house to confront the situation directly and find out what had transpired in our absence. As we drove to my parents' house, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Aunt Sarah. "You need to come over right now," she urged, her voice strained with worry. "What's going on?" I asked, but she dodged the question, insisting we hurry. Anxiety clawed at me as we sped to my childhood home. Something was very wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was, It was bigger than I imagined. Before I could speak, my mom burst into tears, screaming about betrayal and family disgrace. Her voice echoed through the house, leaving me stunned. "How could you do this to us?" she wailed. Her tears streamed down her face, uncontainable. Meanwhile, I stood frozen, my mind racing to understand how my wedding could have caused such an uproar. My father stood stiff in the background, refusing to make eye contact with me. His silence was deafening, a stark contrast to my mother's outburst. "Dad?" I called out, hoping for some support, but he only shook his head. The weight of his disappointment hit me like a ton of bricks. Clearly, whatever had happened while we were away had rocked my family to its core. Inside the house, the living room was filled with relatives who had come to support my parents. Every face was a mix of concern and judgment. Aunt Sarah was there, her eyes red and puffy, while Uncle Ray paced the floor, muttering to himself. The tension was palpable. No one spoke to me directly, but their eyes said it all. They felt betrayed, and I was the cause. My grandfather pulled me aside, his face pale as he whispered, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice cracked, and I could see the distress in his eyes. "Grandpa, I don't understand. What happened?" I asked, desperate for answers. He shook his head, unable to look at me. The gravity of the situation was starting to weigh heavily on me, but I still had no clue what had gone wrong. My cousin hugged me, her face a blend of sorrow and confusion. "We were all so surprised," she said quietly. "You didn't tell anyone?" The sense of incredulity in her voice only deepened my confusion. "I tried," I explained, feeling my frustration rise. Everyone's reactions made it clear that something monumental had been misunderstood. I needed to find out how information about my wedding had been so catastrophically mishandled. My brother, Brandon, sat smugly in a corner, seemingly enjoying the chaos. I caught his eye and he smirked, making my blood boil. "What are you grinning about?" I snapped. His expression didn't change. "Just watching the show," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. His demeanor was infuriating, especially given how often he had undermined me. The atmosphere grew even more hostile with his audacity. My mom's best friend, Mrs. Jenkins, gave me a disapproving shake of her head, as if I had committed an unforgivable act. Her frosty demeanor added to the palpable tension. "I thought you had better sense," she muttered, her voice cold. I tried to muster a response, but words failed me. The judgmental looks and whispered critiques seemed endless, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I felt a rising tide of anger and frustration, struggling to understand the full extent of the fallout. "This is ridiculous," I finally said, my voice shaking. "What exactly are you all so upset about?" The room went silent for a moment, before a wave of accusations and shouts filled the air again. I clenched my fists, feeling overwhelmed by the hostility aimed at me. This was a nightmare come to life. Grandpa, Aunt Sarah, and even distant cousin Mike took turns confronting me about the event. Grandpa's voice trembled with emotion, Aunt Sarah's words were sharp, and cousin Mike seemed genuinely baffled. "How could you? Why didn't you tell us?" Each question was a blow, and I couldn't keep up with the barrage. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of accusations, all stemming from a misunderstanding I still couldn't grasp. Each had a different gripe, but the common theme was betrayal. "You shut us out," Uncle Ray accused. "You didn't even care enough to tell your own parents," Aunt Sarah added. The feeling of being ganged up on was suffocating. "Betrayal? How?" I stammered, trying to defend myself. The room fell silent for a moment, as if everyone was waiting for an explanation that I couldn't yet give. The overwhelming sense of being wronged was universal. Voices were raised, accusations thrown, and tears shed. Aunt Sarah's face was contorted with anger as she gestured wildly. "You think a text message is enough for an occasion like this?" she shouted. Uncle Ray's face was beet red, veins popping as he added his grievances. "Can't believe you'd be so secretive," he yelled. The room was a cacophony of hurt and shouted words. Every claim felt like another dagger thrown my way. Suddenly, an old family friend brought out a laptop, playing a recording of a local evening news segment. The room's chaos died down as everyone turned their attention to the screen. "What is this?" I asked nervously, feeling everyone's eyes shift back to me. I looked to my husband, his face reflecting the same bewilderment. The familiar graphics of the local news station appeared, and my heart rate spiked with anticipation. The headline read, "Local Family Torn Apart by Secret Wedding." My eyes widened in shock, and I heard gasps from around the room. My parents looked horrified, their anger momentarily replaced by disbelief. I felt my knees weaken as the news segment continued. "This can't be real," I whispered to my husband, who was equally stunned. How had our private wedding become a public spectacle? My mind raced, trying to piece it together. My mouth dropped open as I saw clips of my wedding, interspersed with interviews from family members. The footage showed our beautiful ceremony, with my friends and extended family smiling and laughing. But the joyous scenes were interrupted by somber interviews. "We didn't even know it was happening," Aunt Karen's voice said off-screen. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Seeing such an important moment splashed on the news felt like a violation. The news segment featured comments from my parents, who had discovered the truth about my event from Facebook. My mother's tear-streaked face filled the screen. "We were blindsided," she said, her voice breaking. My father's stern expression followed, his words stinging. "We deserved to be there," he said, his tone accusatory. The reality of their pain hit me harder seeing it through the television. It felt all too surreal and invasive. My brother had shared photos and tagged my parents, sparking an avalanche of reactions. "How could you not tell us? Why were we excluded?" The flood of Facebook comments and messages showed the depth of their hurt and confusion. The notifications had stacked up so fast, rumors took on a life of their own. What should have been a private affair turned into a public family scandal, thanks to one ill-timed social media post. In a particularly damning clip, Brandon told a reporter, "I couldn't make it. I had more important things to do." My jaw dropped as I heard those words. His nonchalance and lack of remorse felt like another stab in the back. The reporter didn't question him further, letting his statement hang in the air, doing its damage. That simple line painted me as the inconsiderate, ungrateful child, a narrative I hadn't realized was circulating. The narrative painted me as the villain, sending my parents spiraling into shame and anger. Their community viewed them through a lens of scorn, and every misstep was magnified. My father could hardly show his face at work, and my mother faced side eyes from her book club. The weight of this realization pressed down on me. I had unintentionally caused a rift that went beyond our family, tarnishing their public image as well. Seeing my family's anguish broadcast for all to see, I felt an urgent need to fix everything. My mother's teary eyes and my father's stern face haunted me. I couldn't let this misunderstanding fester any longer. "We need to talk to them," I told my husband, my voice resolute. "But how?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Fixing this mess seemed like an insurmountable task, but I knew we had to try. But where to start? My mind raced through the possibilities. Should we hold a family meeting or try to reach out individually? Each option had its own set of challenges. "We need to get everyone together," I finally said. "We have to clear the air with everybody at once." My husband nodded, though his expression remained tense. It was a daunting task, but no other solution seemed feasible. This was our first step. The impact on my parents' lives had been severe. Their once normal routine had turned into an endless string of whispers and sideways glances. My father, who usually held his head high, now walked with a noticeable slump. My mother, once the life of her social circle, now seemed frail and distant. It felt like the entire town was judging them, and they bore the brunt of this unwanted attention. Both of them had faced judgment at work and whispers in their social circles. My dad, usually surrounded by colleagues, often found himself excluded from casual conversations. His workplace had become a battleground of snide remarks and silent judgments. Meanwhile, my mom, once the center of attention at social events, now found herself the topic of hushed discussions and lingering looks. The emotional strain was visible on both of their faces. My mother's book club had ostracized her, locking her out of their literary conversations and outings. They acted as if mere association with her might taint their pristine lives. Meanwhile, my father's colleagues jokingly asked if they should expect another secret anytime soon. Their laughter, though seemingly harmless, felt like tiny daggers. The betrayal they felt from my wedding was echoed in their community interactions, making each day a fresh struggle for respect. The emotional toll was evident in their gaunt faces and strained voices. My mom's laughter, once so robust, was now fleeting. My dad's normally confident stride had turned hesitant. Their eyes, that always sparkled with a hint of mischief, now looked tired and worn. Every interaction seemed forced, weighed down by the burden of relentless societal judgment. Our home, which was once a haven of joy, had turned into a fortress of sorrow. The entire family felt the ripple effects. Cousins had been unfriended on social media, and even Brandon lost a few football teammates who sided with me. Our family gatherings, once filled with laughter and stories, had turned into awkward silences and palpable tension. Bonds that had seemed unbreakable were now strained, with every relationship put under scrutiny. No one escaped unscathed, and the divisions created were stark and unsettling. The division within our once moderately happy family was stark and unsettling. Conversations that were once second nature now felt forced and stilted. Every interaction had an underlying tension, a wariness of stepping on emotional landmines. I could feel the glares, the whispers, and the pointed questions. The once tight-knit family fabric was now frayed and hanging by a thread, with every member picking sides and drawing lines in the sand. Determined to address the misunderstanding, I gathered the family in the living room and started telling them everything from my perspective. Faces, some curious and others skeptical, stared back at me. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding with the weight of the moment. "I know you're hurt," I began, my voice shaky but clear. "But there are things you need to understand about that day." The room fell silent, waiting for my explanation. I explained how every important event in my life had been overshadowed by Brandon. "Every time I had a moment that mattered, something always came up with him," I said, my eyes scanning their faces. "It wasn't due to a lack of trying on my part to include you," I added, pausing to gather my thoughts. Their expressions varied, some understanding, others still skeptical. I continued, hoping to make them see my side. My recital, my graduation, even my engagement party, the focus always shifted towards him. "Remember my high school graduation?" I asked, my voice tinged with bitterness. "While I was receiving my diploma, Brandon got into a fight, and all of you rushed to him." The memories flooded back, each overshadowed moment stinging as I recounted them. "I just wanted one event, one moment, to be completely about me," I confessed, tears welling up. As I spoke, some faces softened, while others remained hard and incriminating. Aunt Sarah nodded slightly, her eyes showing a glimmer of understanding. Grandpa looked conflicted, torn between his loyalty to my parents and empathy for me. Yet, Uncle Ray's expression remained stern, unyielding. "It was never my intention to hurt any of you," I said, my voice cracking. "I just needed one thing in my life to be mine." "I never intended to hurt any of you," I said, tears rolling down my cheeks. The weight of their judgment was heavy, and the words were difficult to get out. Silence settled over the room, making my heart race even faster. My mother's sobs softened slightly, but the tension was still thick. It felt like I was standing on trial, emotionally naked in front of my family. "I just wanted you to understand," I added, striving to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted one thing to be about me." The words hung in the air like a fragile promise. Faces varied, some showed glimmers of understanding, others still bore hard lines of judgment. Aunt Sarah's eyes softened as she wiped away a tear. I pressed on. My whole life, every important moment has been overshadowed by Brandon. Some nodded, recalling past events. I needed them to understand my perspective, to see why this moment was so essential for me. My confession seemed to crack open some empathy among the relatives. Aunt Sarah looked at me differently, more understanding than before. Uncle Ray, usually so stern, softened a bit. Even Grandpa seemed to relax, his eyes losing some of their hard edges. The tension in the room didn't vanish, but it lessened slightly. Relieved, I took a deep breath, feeling like a small step toward reconciliation had been made, even though the journey was far from over. Aunt Sarah held my hand, nodding in understanding. Her touch was warm, grounding me in that moment. "We're listening," she said softly, her eyes encouraging me to continue. The murmurs in the room died down as more family members focused on what I had to say. Grandpa adjusted his glasses, leaning in slightly as if to catch every word. A sense of cautious hope began to permeate the room, giving me the strength to keep explaining. Some relatives murmured amongst themselves, while Grandpa asked if I had intended for the event to be secretive. His words were measured yet filled with genuine curiosity. "Did you mean to keep us in the dark?" he inquired, his eyes searching mine for the truth. A few heads nodded in agreement, wanting to hear my answer. I sighed deeply, feeling the weight of their expectation. "No," I said, preparing myself to explain my side fully. "It wasn't meant to be a secret," I clarified, looking each of them in the eye. "I sent the invitations and even texted a reminder," I continued, my voice trying to convey sincerity. The room fell silent, every ear attentive to my words. Aunt Sarah squeezed my hand, providing silent support. My parents exchanged glances, processing what I was saying. I could see the confusion and hurt, but also a sliver of understanding beginning to emerge. "I sent the invitations and even texted a reminder. What was I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice strained with frustration and hurt. I glanced around the room, hoping my words would sink in. Aunt Karen's tense face finally softened a little. "I tried so hard to include everyone," I added, feeling a small glimmer of hope as the expressions around me began to shift, if only slightly. The collective tension eased just a bit. The mood shifted slightly as the truth began to settle in. Some nods of understanding replaced the stern looks. My parents' rigid postures softened a bit. The air, still tense, was no longer suffocating. "We didn't realize," Aunt Sarah murmured, her voice breaking the silence. Everyone seemed to seek answers in one another's eyes. Although the road to mending the family rift was still daunting, a fragile bridge of empathy started to form. To help build bridges, my husband suggested a family gathering to discuss our side and listen to theirs. It seemed like a logical next step, so we took a collective breath and agreed. "Maybe if everyone hears it all together, it'll make more sense," he said, his voice steady. I nodded, feeling a bit more hopeful. We needed to address the issues openly if we were ever going to heal these wounds and find a way forward. We arranged a dinner at our home, and slowly, albeit reluctantly, most of the immediate relatives agreed to come. The night of the dinner, there was a palpable mix of anticipation and anxiety in the air. My husband and I set the table and prepared the meal, trying to keep our nerves in check. As relatives started arriving, I could sense their hesitation, but also a slight openness. This was a crucial step toward understanding and possibly mending our fractured family. At the dinner, we spoke openly about the wedding and what had transpired. "We sent the invites. We wanted you there," I began, trying to make my voice steady. Everyone listened intently, the air thick with tension. "I texted reminders," I continued, seeing my parents' faces soften slightly. Brandon, however, looked completely uninterested. "We never wanted to exclude you," I emphasized, striving to convey our earnest intentions. My parents, while still hurt, started to see the broader picture. "So you did send invitations?" my dad asked, his brow furrowed in thought. "Yes, and I even followed up with texts," I confirmed. My mother sighed deeply, her face reflecting a multitude of emotions. "It seems like there was a misunderstanding," she said softly, her eyes meeting mine. For the first time, she seemed to see my side of the story. I apologized for the hurt they felt, and they began to understand my lifelong struggle for acknowledgement. "I'm so sorry for the pain this has caused you both," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. Tears welled up in my mom's eyes as I continued. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I've always felt overshadowed by Brandon, and this was the one thing I just wanted for myself." They nodded, finally beginning to understand. The conversation was heavy but necessary. A step towards emotional healing. Voices lowered as we navigated through our tangled feelings. "We had no idea you felt this way," my dad admitted, his voice soft yet pained. Aunt Sarah chimed in. "It's clear that a lot of communication was missing." Grandfather nodded in agreement, his face drawn in thought. Slowly, the dialogue became more constructive, a patchwork of apologies, explanations, and long overdue understanding. Just when it seemed like progress was being made, Brandon dropped a bombshell. "You know she didn't even want you there, right?" he said casually, leaning back in his chair. The room fell silent, every eye suddenly fixed on him. I felt a surge of panic and anger. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, feeling the fragile peace we had started to build shake. Brandon's smirk only deepened as he prepared to elaborate. He had told our parents last minute that the event was of little significance to dissuade them from attending. "I figured if I downplay it, they wouldn't feel so bad," Brandon said, his tone dripping with feigned innocence. My parents looked horrified, betrayal etched across their faces. "Why would you do that?" my mom whispered, her voice breaking. Brandon shrugged, completely unbothered. His revelation struck like a dagger, shattering any progress we had made. His malice-filled eyes bore into mine as he spoke, and the room fell into shocked silence. "Really, Brandon?" I replied, my voice barely audible. "How could you do this?" My heart pounded in my chest as everyone processed his words. Aunt Sarah gasped, putting a hand to her mouth, while Grandpa's face turned an even paler shade. The silence was deafening, the weight of Brandon's actions hanging heavily in the air. My mom broke down in tears again, this time out of grief for her son's manipulative behavior. "I can't believe you would do something so cruel," she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. Uncle Ray put a comforting arm around her, but the damage was done. The room's atmosphere plunged back into despair. My dad turned away, his shoulders slumped. The grief and betrayal were almost tangible, suffocating the fragile hope we had. Anger bubbled up in me, but seeing my parents so broken made me soften. "This has to stop," I said, my voice shaking with both fury and sadness. "We can't let Brandon's actions dictate our family's well-being. I looked around the room, seeing nods of agreement from some relatives. We need to move forward, but it has to be together, I implored, hoping to reignite the unity we so desperately needed. The room descended into arguments and blame, shaking the fragile peace we had started to build. "This is all your fault!" Uncle Ray yelled at Brandon, who merely shrugged. Aunt Sarah chimed in, her voice rising with frustration. My mom's sobs grew louder while my dad tried to restore order. Voices overlapped, each person desperate to be heard. The fragile understanding we had started to achieve seemed to implode under the weight of renewed conflict. The full truth came out during a particularly heated exchange that followed. Voices clashed and emotions ran high as Brandon finally admitted his part in the chaos. His words were like cold water on a blazing fire, momentarily silencing everyone. My parents looked bewildered, and the room's energy changed instantly. It was evident that the revelation would have repercussions beyond what anyone expected. The tension thickened, and everyone awaited Brandon's next words. I always felt overshadowed by the idea of sharing the family spotlight, Brandon confessed. His voice, usually so confident, wavered slightly. I went as far as sabotaging your events to ensure I remained the focus, he continued, finally revealing the extent of his actions. The weight of his admission hung in the air. My parents' faces were a mixture of shock and disbelief. This truth had been buried for so long, and now it was out in the open. The revelation left everyone stunned, but especially my parents, who felt betrayed on a deeper level. My mother's eyes were wide with shock, and my father stood rigid, unable to process the words. "You did what?" my mom whispered, her voice tinged with hurt. "Why, Brandon?" My dad's face turned pale, his disappointment palpable. The realization of Brandon's machinations added a new layer to their grief, deepening the familial wounds that needed healing. They realized they had been pawns in a cruel sibling rivalry, orchestrated by Brandon. "It all makes sense now," my dad said, his tone grim and weary. My mom's face twisted in sorrow as she began to piece together the years of manipulation. "He's been doing this for so long," she murmured. The sense of betrayal ran deep, and their eyes reflected the weight of being used. The full scope of Brandon's actions was almost too much to bear. The realization left them gutted, but also more open to rebuilding their relationship with me. "I had no idea it was this bad," my mom admitted, tears streaming down her face. My dad nodded, his expression softening. "We should have paid more attention," he said quietly. They seemed ready to take the first steps toward healing the fractures in our family. "Can we start over?" my mom asked, her voice filled with a newfound hope. Our story wasn't just about a missed wedding. It was about lifelong wounds finally coming to light. Each revelation peeled back layers of hidden hurt and misunderstanding. "This isn't just about the wedding," I said softly. "It's about everything that's been building up for years." The family began to see the bigger picture, understanding that our issues were deeper and more complex. The path to mending our broken bonds seemed clearer, albeit more daunting. We decided as a family to seek counseling to better understand our dynamics and heal together. "We need professional help to move forward," my dad said, his voice resolute. "I'll arrange sessions," I offered, feeling a flicker of hope. My mom nodded, everyone agreeing to give it a try. "We've got a lot to work through," Aunt Sarah added. The decision marked a crucial turning point, showing our commitment to healing and rebuilding our strained relationships. The road to recovery was long, but my parents started making an effort to be more inclusive and attentive to my life. "How's your new project at work going?" my dad would ask, genuinely interested. My mom began calling just to chat, a big change from the past. It wasn't easy, but seeing their efforts was heartening. We're trying, my mom would often say, and I could see the sincerity in her eyes. Brandon faced his own consequences, reconciling with his actions and working on his relationship with each family member. I know I've hurt you all, he admitted during one of our counseling sessions. He began making amends, attending his own therapy, and trying to rebuild trust. It's not going to be easy, I told him. I know, he acknowledged, seeming genuinely contrite. His journey towards redemption was separate, but equally vital for our family's overall healing. In the end, the missed wedding became a turning point that brought our family closer, finally recognizing the love and support we all needed. Family gatherings took on a new warmth and sincerity. Celebrations felt more genuine, and our communication improved drastically. We understood each other better and prioritized our collective well-being. I never thought this would bring us together, Aunt Sarah mused. It had been a rough journey, but we emerged stronger and more united.